Could this be the best wildlife lens Nikon has ever produced? I've been using this lens since its release, and in this video I'm going to share my honest review. This isn't just about specs, it's about what the lens is truly like to use in the field, and I've got some surprising results to share. For those new to the channel, my name is Mark Dumbleton. I'm a professional wildlife photographer from South Africa, and I've used this lens extensively in the field. And one way I like to use it is actually to hand hold. So let's start out with the handling of the lens. Like I said, I like to hand hold this lens. It allows me a lot of freedom to shoot, especially birds in flight, and also to grab shots when I'm driving inside of a vehicle or in a safari vehicle. I can quickly pick the lens up and grab the shots without too much worry. On the screen now is the weight of the lens alone with the tripod collar and the lens hood, and then also with the Nikon Z8 attached. So you can see it's not terribly heavy. I think after a long time hand holding the lens, it might become a bit tiring, but I find that for my needs, I can shoot handheld a lot with this lens. Now, some of the external features of the lens that I really like. The zoom ring is fantastic. On the old Nikon 200 to 500, you used to really have to turn the lens to go from 200 to 500. But on this one, it's just a very quick turn. You can hear there, it's going from 180 to 600 really, really quickly. So I really like that. Now, also on the lens, I've got a lens coat, which is obviously optional, but I do like the added protection. And also when I'm shooting from a hide, the little bit of design on there does help camouflage the lens a little bit. And one thing when I'm hand holding the lens is you can see here, let me just take this one off, that is the manual zoom ring. Now, when I've used this lens without the lens coat, if I was hand holding it, I would often bump the manual zoom ring and it would switch over to manual focus. But I've found since I've had this lens coat on, I actually haven't had that problem. The tripod collar here, I like to use it like this. It's now on top of the lens, and obviously I like to use that because it's nice to hand hold, and I feel like the lens just fits nicely in the hand without that tripod collar at the bottom there. Now, this is a tripod collar that was kindly sent to me by Leophoto South Africa. It is a aftermarket add-on. It's an upgrade to the Nikon tripod collar, which I didn't really like for a few reasons. This tripod collar, first of all, is a lot longer. When you're holding the lens like that and carrying it from one place to the other, it's a lot firmer grip, a lot bigger grip, which is really comfortable. There's also a nice silicone padding there, which just gives you an extra bit of added support when you are holding the lens via the lens collar. Now, this tripod collar I feel like is a lot smoother than the original Nikon one. And also on top of the lens collar here, you can see a lot of extra mounts for accessories, which is really nice. You know, sometimes I do shoot video and it's nice to mount a big microphone on top here rather than on the camera, because I often find when I'm shooting, the microphone, it taps me on the head here. So I like to mount that onto the lens collar. But one of the biggest advantages of this aftermarket lens collar from Leophoto is it has a built-in Arcus Swiss style plate. Now, one issue I had with the original Nikon tripod collar is I had to put an extra plate on there and it would come loose now and then. So that is a potential failure point when you have this mounted to a tripod. So having the built-in Arcus Swiss plate on the lens plate, that really does make a massive difference and gives you a lot more peace of mind. Now, just going back to the zoom, you can see I'm moving from 180 to 600 and the lens size doesn't change. Now, I really, really like that, especially when you are resting this on a beanbag. You know, the lens doesn't extend and maybe get caught on the beanbag, or if you're shooting out of a hide, the lens doesn't get longer. I just find that's such a good design. The lens does have 4 programmable buttons, which I don't use at all. I did try them out in the beginning, but I often find that I struggle to find the buttons, and eventually I just gave up using that. And I don't really have a need for those programmable buttons. So yeah, I guess that simplifies the way that I shoot as well. But also having this lens coat on here, you know, then the buttons are covered. So, you know, again, I don't use those buttons at all. One great advantage of this lens is the VR. Nikon claims to have a 5.5 stop VR system built in here, which is really, really nice to handhold at slow shutter speeds. There are two different modes available on VR. There's a full VR and then there's a sport VR. The full VR eliminates shake on both the horizontal and vertical axis. So that is really nice if you're hand holding the lens at a very slow shutter speed. That keeps your frame very, very stable. And then the other one is the sport VR mode, which allows the ability to pan. You'll find if you're using the full VR and panning, you might get a little bit of like a jerky motion, but on the sports mode, it allows for very, very smooth panning, which I really like if I am shooting wildlife at faster shutter speeds. So I tend to use sports mode when the light is good and my shutter speeds are fine and nice and fast. And then I switch back to full VR when I'm shooting very, very slow shutter speeds when I need the lens to be as still as possible. I have found if I am using full VR, sometimes when I'm taking multiple bursts of photos, the viewfinder seems to jerk a little bit as soon as I take the photograph. But if I switch back to sports mode and do the same thing, the viewfinder doesn't jerk around at all. So I'm assuming when you use the full VR, the VR system is bringing the image back to the middle of the frame, if that makes sense, on that full VR mode. Here you can see an example of VR in action. I've got a very slow shutter speed and I'm hand holding the lens 100%, it's not resting on anything. And you can see how stable that is. And now just for comparison, I've taken the VR off and now you can see without VR how shaky it is. And this is at 600 millimeters. Another nice feature on this lens is weather sealing. Together with the body, I've got a Z8 here. So if I'm shooting in rain, I don't worry about the lens getting wet. The lens is very well weather sealed, so I don't worry about water falling onto the lens. I do have a rain cover that I use from time to time if it's a very, very heavy downpour. And if I'm shooting for extended periods in the rain, I will use that. I do use this microfiber cloth in a heavy downpour if I want to grab a photograph very quickly and not want to fuss around with this. And if I feel like the rain is a bit too heavy and it's going to make my camera super wet, I will just throw this over the camera and lens just to give it a bit of protection. Now, I also then use this to dry off the camera and lens if I have shot this in the rain. So it's nice just to throw it over and just give it a quick dry so the lens and the camera doesn't sit wet for too long. The lens is 180 millimeters to 600 millimeters. At 180 millimeters, the aperture is 5.6. And at 600, it goes to 6.3. Now, from 180 to 300 millimeters, the maximum aperture is 5.6. Then when you go from 300 to 500, the maximum aperture changes to f6. And then from 500 millimeters to 600 millimeters, the aperture changes to 6.3. Now, one of the big questions or the main questions I get asked about this lens is the aperture. Is it good enough for gathering enough light? And does it render backgrounds nicely out of focus? Let's first talk about the background blur that the 6.3 renders. I've got this image. This was shot at ISO 400 at 550 millimeters, f6.3. You can see it's rendered the background nicely out of focus. The focus is on the eye there, and you can see the nose is slightly out of focus, but the background falls nicely out of focus there. So that was at 6.3. In this example, 600 millimeters at f6.3, again, you can see that background is nicely blurred out. You know, obviously, the closer you get to your subject, the more the distant background will be rendered out of focus. Here's another example, 6.3. That background was fairly far away from the bird, but it's beautifully out of focus there. Another example, another one here. This zebra was quite close to the background. This is at 430 millimeters at f6.3. So you can see the background is separated nicely from that subject. So again, I don't think 6.3 is terrible when it comes to background blur. Obviously, bigger primes at f4 or f2.8 will render that a lot more out of focus, but that's just the trade-off you get for the versatility of the lens. And there's another example at f6.3 at 410 millimeters. Want to add mood and drama to your wildlife photography? Grab my free Lightroom Tools preset pack. It applies some of my favorite editing techniques with ease. Download it now via the link in the description. Now, talking about low light performance, here's an example, f6.3, ISO 16000 at 600 millimeters. Now, here's the raw file. So I'm just going to zoom in. Now, remember, when you are shooting at very high ISO speeds, you are going to lose a lot of detail because of that high ISO, that graininess that is present on your image. So this is pretty sharp, I would say, for a ISO 16000 image. You can see there, the background is nicely out of focus. It is quite noisy, but there's the processed file. And you can see I've managed to sharpen that detail up nicely. Obviously, it's not perfect because it's run through some AI software and I've added some editing techniques to it. But that just gives you a good idea of what you can achieve at those high ISOs at those apertures. Another example, we've got 25,600 here at 210 millimeters. That's the sharpness I got at that extremely high ISO. You can see my shutter speed was 1/200th of a second. And then here is the edited version. You can see we've brought back some real nice sharpness there. And then we've gotten rid of a lot of noise. Another example, ISO 12,800 at 510 millimeters. This one, I guess, is slightly softer. I think the AF system was struggling. It was real low lights. It was pitch black with a torch, but I think the detail is enough to render a nice image. f6.3, you can see my shutter speed there, 125th of a second. And then here is the edited image. It's nice and sharp, and that background nice and clean. Now, the versatility of the lens is what sold me, and I probably would never buy another prime lens again. I really love the versatility the 180-600 gives me. Now, there is an argument to be said for a nice big prime lens. Obviously, the aperture is a lot wider, and the quality will be slightly sharper. Now, I feel like with these modern lenses, and especially this 180-600, the sharpness is really good. I'm quite impressed. Now, over my career, I've shot with a Nikon 600 f4, a 400 2.8, a 200 to 400. I've shot with a 500 5.6 PF, and I'm comparing this lens to my experiences with all of those lenses. Now, back in the day when I was shooting with the old 600 f4, I was using a lower resolution camera. I think it was a D4 at that stage. So the high resolution does help. But I find for wildlife photography, it's very difficult for me to choose something over this lens. If there was a 600mm next to me or this one, I would probably grab this one. And on the computer now, I'll show you some examples of the versatility of the lens. Now, let's just take this one, for example. This is at 210mm with a static leopard on the street. That's 210mm at 5.6, 1/500th of a second. Then we're going into 280mm. The leopard's not moving. I'm also not moving my position. Then we've got 600mm here. So you can see I've framed up a much different shot. And then this is another one at 600mm. So just through those four images, you can see the versatility really does offer you quite a lot of opportunity. Here's another one, 270mm. And then I switched to 600. This one at 430mm. And then this sighting here, 250 at f5.6. And then 530, you can see just by zooming in a lot there, it's given me a lot of opportunity for a different composition. Now, that flexibility in the field for me is priceless. And I've got a video to show you here, which I actually captured back in a couple of years ago of a lion chasing a zebra. I was using a Nikon 500 PF, and you can see the lion chase the zebra straight towards my vehicle. And the amount of photos I got, 0. When the lion started chasing the zebra, it was filling the frame, and as it got closer, it was completely too close. So if I had this lens on there, I definitely would have come away with a lot more images from that sighting, and potentially got the lion trying to jump onto the back of that zebra, possibly at about 200mm or 250mm. So the versatility of the lens, for me, is the most important thing, because I feel like capturing the moment is more important than capturing a perfectly pin sharp image using a very expensive lens, and perhaps paying triple or quadruple the price you would pay for this lens. Talking about image quality and autofocus, I'll touch on lens corrections a little bit here quickly. Chromatic aberration and distortion, I never worry about that. Lightroom gets rid of chromatic aberration very well. I don't find there to be much chromatic aberration, so I almost feel like it's not even worth talking about. And then distortion, I never eliminate distortion from a shot. In Lightroom, I just find that the distortion is hardly even noticeable in my opinion. Now, autofocus on this lens is incredibly fast, and I've got an example to show you here. I am using a Nikon Z8, so the autofocus obviously is, captained by the camera, but it's communicating with the lens very well, and it's changing the focus distance extremely well, and I'm very, very impressed. Now I've got this set of images to show you here. I've got a Southern Carmine bee eater, and it's taking off straight towards me. Now I did have bird tracking on my Nikon Z8, so the bird tracking worked extremely well. So you can see here, I'm going to zoom in. These are all 100% crops on the image, and I have no sharpening on any of these images, and these are all with no edits as well. So you can see that's the first frame, that's the second frame, the third frame, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. Okay, the 10th image is slightly blurred, and then the next one is slightly out of focus, and that one, I guess, is out of focus as well. But you can see the bird is on the very edge of the frame, and I had more of a centered autofocus area. So now you can see that from the results of that sequence, that bird is moving incredibly fast. Now for the tracking, to keep track of that bird, communicate with the lens, and change that focus distance in mere split seconds, I think I was shooting at 20 frames per second. So that's probably half a second's worth of shots. So there's 12 shots there. So it's just over half a second. So you can see the autofocus on this lens is incredibly quick. You know, I'm not going to compare this to other lenses because I don't have something else to compare it to. But just by this example, I'm sure you can see the speed and accuracy of the autofocus. Using this lens with a teleconverter, I would not recommend. You can use it with a 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter, but I don't recommend that because you are going to lose quality and you're also going to lose light. When you use a 1.4 converter, you lose 1 stop of light, and a 2x you'll lose 2 stops. So in my opinion, rather use a high resolution camera if you have, and rather just crop. I think you'll get sharper results just by cropping than you would do using a teleconverter. Before we look at some results on pinpoint sharpness, I just wanted to chat quickly about the comparison between this lens, the 180-600, and a potential 100-400 as well. Now the Nikon 100-400S lens on the Z range is a lot more expensive. Now you're only going from 100 to 400 millimeters. You are gaining probably slightly sharper performance and a slightly wider aperture, but you are missing, in my opinion, one of the most important ranges on a lens for wildlife photography, and that's 500, 600 millimeters. I've looked at my metadata on my Lightroom when using this lens, and the majority of shots I take are all at 600 millimeters. So my advice as a wildlife photographer would be to rather buy the 180-600. It is a lot cheaper than the 100-400, and then I would buy something a lot wider to fill in the gap below the 180 mils. So something like a 24-200 or a 24-120. You know, the 24-120 and the 180-600 would cost roughly about the same as one lens, and that being the 100-400. So that would be my advice. I haven't used the 100-400, so I can't speak very clearly about the performance of that lens. But just in terms of versatility and in my experience, what I've used the most, I find wildlife photography, you're going to be using that long focal length the majority of the time. Now let's talk about one of the most important factors. How sharp is this lens? I've got 5 images here. There are various focal lengths that I want to compare. Now I am going to export these images to high resolution JPEGs if you want to download them and have a look at them. There's a link in the description. And the reason why I want to have these available for download is because I don't have another lens to compare them to. So the idea here is for you to have a nice close-up look at these files, and then you can compare them to whatever lens you may have or whatever lens you have had experience with, and you can see the results for yourself. This is at 180 millimeters. The images have no sharpening applied or any edits to them. These are purely untouched raw files. So you can see that is 180 millimeters at f5.6. I think stopping the lens down slightly, maybe to f6.3 or 7.1, perhaps will sharpen up the detail very, very slightly. And it's something that I don't tend to do very often because I find that the performance wide open for me is very satisfactory, and I don't find it necessary to drop down the aperture to increase that sharpness, because then you're also compromising the out of focus background when doing that. The next one is at 290 millimeters. So you can see there's the eye of the leopard, again with no sharpening applied, ISO 1600. So it's slightly noisy. You're going to lose a little bit of detail because of that higher ISO, although 1600 isn't very high. 410 mils, this line was quite close to the car. but you can see it's pin sharp, and I'm really happy with the performance at 410 mils. You can see it there, f6.3, ISO 3600. So again, you've lost a little bit of sharpness there because of that ISO, but not too much. This image at 500 mils, it's f6.3. You can see there's some really nice sharpness on the eye there, and the autofocus picked up that eye perfectly well through the grass here. You can see the really nice detail on that image there. And then on this leopard image at 600 millimeters, let's just raise up the exposure a little bit. So you can see that's the full image, and then cropping in, you can see that really nice detail there. This one's at ISO 1000, and because it was slightly underexposed, it has increased the noise a little bit, but you can get a good idea of the sharpness of this lens. The Nikon 180-600 in summary is, for me, the perfect wildlife lens, and it's probably the most versatile and capable wildlife lens I've ever owned. Now, like I said earlier, I've had big primes, I've had the 400 2.8, I've had a 600 f4, and the versatility is what makes this lens. That 180 mils to 600 mils is hands down what sold me on this lens, and hands down why I think this is the best wildlife lens you could buy for your money. Now, if you've got unlimited budget, by all means, go buy a big 600 mil prime. Those lenses will be magnificent. But for the general photographer, and even for me as a professional photographer, I would rather have something like this to allow me to change the focal length and to capture those amazing photos. I would have loved to photograph that lion sighting with this lens. Now, if you want to see me taking some photographs in the wilderness with this Z8 and 180-600, check out this video next, where I show you a behind the scenes look at how I take my wildlife photographs.